in this new webinar out of our series, and welcome to all of you, all the ones that are already there. Can I have my next slide, please? Because we are going to discuss real-world evidence or real-world data. I would guess that'll be already one of the discussion points if we talk about data and evidence and what's the difference between the two. And as you see on the agenda today, we'll start with some introductions, what I'm doing right now. Then we'll discuss about real-world evidence, its place right now in the whole market access spectrum of activities. Then we'll have most of the time a panel discussion, and we have also left over time at the end for questions of the audience. Now, who are we? Well, I am, if you have the next slide, please, I'm Raf de Wilde. I will be moderating the session, and you hear me every now and then speaking to Stephen, who is organizing the webinars, making it work, and also takes care of a lot of the content in discussing with me. And thank you, Stephen, to get this one going again. Now, we also have 3 guests. And the guests, I would say, if you could shortly introduce yourself, one per one. Let's start with Jim.
Yeah, hi, Jim Ballinger. I'm have been in managed care pharmacy for around 32 years in the United States, with various roles, both regionally and nationally. My primary focus has been on areas like formulary management, clinical program design, trend management, specialty drug oversight, contracting oversight. So, you know, I've worked most recently as a chief pharmacy officer for a regional PBM, but have also worked in national roles with companies like United Healthcare, Medco, and Cigna.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Marco, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, for sure. Good afternoon, good morning to everybody. I'm from Italy, from Rome. I'm a physician by training. I'm a public health physician, and I worked for more than 20 years in a huge university hospital in Italy, both in the medical direction of the hospital, and for the last 15 years, I go through the manage an health technology assessment unit in the context of this hospital. Since 4 years, I'm the director of the National Center for HTA in the Italian National Public Health Institute. This institute is the technical research support for the Ministry of Health.
Thank you, Michael.
Hello, I'm Nico Treba. 10 years ago, I was on the side of regulatory and payers. And my role actually was signing off all the reimbursement decisions for SUKL for the Czech Republic. So my role was national. And now I'm at Pharmaca doing consultancy work for market access. And we deal with also modeling. And this is actually our mainstream, and utilizing also the RWE data for it.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your introduction. Thank you, Injich. And we are going now into a very short introduction because the subject's already well known. Now, something practical first is that the audience is muted right now. We will open it totally at the end when we have the discussion. But if you have questions in between, or would like to add something, or would have to ask an urgent question to one of our panel members or me, you can do this through the questions box, which will be monitored by Stephen, who will then alert us if something joins immediately to the discussion. Most questions, though, we'll keep for the end of the webinar, where we will discuss them in the general discussion at the end. Obviously, we are all working somewhere, but in the webinar here, it's like, let's have fun and really discuss in depth and say what we think. So we are not per se giving the view of the organizations we are working for. We are giving our personal views. And that is also true for you, dear audience. If you connect us or so, you can also have that same position. Let's go quickly into the introduction. because introducing real-world evidence is really pretty straightforward. I mean, I'm sure that all of you know very well where we are going to talk about today. So I'm just giving you the definition from ISPOR, which is straightforward. Anything which is not a real phase 3 clinical trial is roughly called as part of real-world data. And real-world evidence is different from real-world data, obviously, because that's the evidence that you believe is derived, so the elements that are substantiated from the data that you get, from the real-world data that you get. Now, if we look at the right-hand side in the quote there, it's very nice to see that article from Polini. We really expresses the opinion that we see very often lately. In the last 3-4 years, we saw a whole series of critical articles from authorities and scientists and leading payers in the world that say, yes, real-world evidence is something that's complementary to the traditional randomized controlled trials, because these remain the gold standard of evidence, but you have real-world evidence on top of it as additional information. That's an important point. We are not going here to debate about a competition between randomized clinical trials and real-world evidence. At least that's not the idea, although obviously our panel has the freedom to touch upon this topic while we go about it. Now, I've been in real-world evidence for a very long time. I had a group who was working on real-world evidence for the largest part of my career. We had people that were touching upon these data and a whole team for some time even. So, and you were almost waiting to when are we going beyond claims analysis? When is this going to become really big? And we're expecting already 20 years ago that you would have an influence of data that would stimulate the possibilities and the opportunities to use real-world evidence. Now, it all has gone a little bit slower, but right now it seems to have changed. We do see a very big growth of real-world evidence as a concept in the pharmaceutical industry. We had research done from Deloitte they found in 2016, they were asking companies, are you doing real-world evidence? And half of them said we are busy to develop or improve our capability to support real-world evidence. And 2 years later, 2018, they didn't use the same questions even anymore. They asked other things like, do you already have a major real-world evidence capacity? Because in that time frame, most companies moved from doing a little bit of real-world evidence to making a serious attempt of integrating real-world data and real-world evidence in what they were doing. And this also translates into the publications. I think I'm not sure when we looked at this one because the last number in it seems to be 2020, but you could do this at any time and you'll just see how the real-world evidence studies, observational data publications, etc., are really booming. Also, when you compare them to the clinical trials, which actually are more or less stable or even going down these days as number of publications. So you could also measure it on the number of symposia and congresses and probably webinars about real-world evidence, so that everybody is really interested in these aspects and says, yes, this is where we have to go to. Now, let's discuss the background to this more now and get into a debate on what real-world evidence means for our panel that will be mainly giving the opinion of payers, but are also close enough to the industry to bring some industry input and have the other side. And if they don't, I'll do, because I'm always have been cloned close to industry. Now, Stephen, this one is not building apparently. So we have here the first series of questions that I would like to discuss with our panelists. And so all the first questions are just about, okay, real world evidence. What do you think about it? What's your own view of real world evidence? And I would say just start, yeah, as you wish. The first one starts. Please, otherwise, Marco, would you like to start?
Yes, no problem. I mean, real world evidence. Actually, I'm talking about from the perspective of payers, from a perspective of regulators. Is becoming more and more important in the last few years for a very simple reason, because we have had in the last 7, 8 years the introduction of new drugs in a more early stage of their development. Now I'm thinking about, for example, two hepatitis C treatment that was introduced with study of a few hundred of patients, phase 2 study. So this because the innovation has been becoming more and more disruptive with respect to the last 10, 15 years. So if we are going to wait for the standard data coming from clinical trial, it means that we have a potential big delay in the introduction of new technology. So in the meantime, we have to, and this is the effort of the regulators. You know that in Italy we have the National Agency for Drug that since more than 10 years have started with a set of register for new drug that have sufficient evidence in order to be reimbursed and priced. So the role of the real world evidence, I agree with what you said before, is complementary to the data coming from the clinical trial, but is needed because up to now we are going to introduce, and I think that in the future this will be happen more and more often, many drug without having sufficient evidence with respect to the effectiveness and to the safety in particular. The last case that is on the newspaper all over the world is, for example, the vaccination for COVID-19 SARS-2. So we have very low information with respect to the safety of this vaccination, and we have very low information with respect to the follow-up in terms of how the immunity is going to do and so on. So many study of real-world evidence, at least in Italy, but I think that is the same all over the world, has been started in order to have a feedback from the real world data, what happened when you go through the vaccination and different vaccines that are available in different parts of the world. So, my opinion is that I don't think that the real world evidence could be, a parameter for the introduction of the new drug. So, real world evidence cannot substitute the data coming from clinical trial, but they can add further information when the technology is into the market and is very useful in order to reevaluate and in case we negotiate from a payer perspective the value of the technology.
Thank you. Jim, would you like to give your input on that?
Sure. I mean, we don't see a lot traditionally in the U.S. We haven't seen a lot of real-world evidence early in the product life cycle. I mean, manufacturers are trying to satisfy FDA demands for information they need to approve a drug, and so that's where the RCT comes in. And a lot of the emphasis has been on let's get the drug approved, and then we'll start to see this stuff emerge as we get later in the product life cycle. So, you know, the FDA has loosened the constraints a little bit. They've made it possible for manufacturers and their representatives to get out a little earlier and start to talk about some of this stuff as it accumulates. But really the most valuable RWE for us, you know, speaking in the management of pharmacy benefits and the like, comes once the drug has entered the real world, if you will. So it's, you know, what we start to see then are patterns of utilization. You start to see when drugs are going to be used ahead of other drugs. Does a new drug become a standard of care? Does it replace an older one, et cetera? So, you know, it traditionally has been much more important as the product ages and moves into various stages of its life cycle. And we have, you know, we have to incorporate that information as it becomes available. So, you know, we have done a lot of, as new drugs get released on the market, our focus has been on how did the FDA label it? What was the indication? What was it approved for use in? Then we have to regularly go back and revisit all these clinical areas as real world evidence starts to come in. We start to see patterns of adherence and compliance. You start to see other analyses like ICER coming out. You get to hear from specialists about off-label use and so on. And we have to adapt our coverage criteria to allow us to incorporate that and reflect current standards of medical practice. And so it gets more important as time goes on, and we're seeing more and more of it being developed. And in my mind, we're only touching the surface, scratching the surface, if you will, of what we can expect to do with RWE over the next several years.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Jim, when Obama came into office already quite some time ago, you had this whole drive towards real-world evidence for comparative effectiveness. Is that still alive, or is that fully dead?
It's still alive. I think, you know, we don't, you know, manufacturers are starting to do more head-to-head studies, and we still don't get them all the time. And there are certain disease states where head-to-head studies just aren't going to get done. I mean, the risk of them is too high. You know, a manufacturer could do a long study and then find out that they're the second best drug, and nobody wants to do that. So, but there is generally a consensus. I mean, we have used indirect analyses for a long time, looking at product inserts and the like, but we're starting to see some head-to-head data. Some of the biologic categories, we've seen drugs compared to each other. And that has changed some of the dynamic as far as what prescribers are likely to choose when they're treating a disease.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jindrich, I didn't forget you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that I absolutely agree with Jim and Marco. I would actually see the value of RWE data in the strengths to confirm actually many assumptions. If you look at the payers, for instance, when they are seeing some health economic evaluations, they also tend to confirm the data that are presented for the existing competitors, the reimbursed strategy, through their own data that they have in the house. Then, of course, for the regulators, the real-world data are essential for confirming the safety of the drug in the long term. And for us, I explained that we are actually on the side of the companies or working for the companies. I think it's essential also to confirm our assumption on extrapolations of survival analysis, for instance, this is quite crucial. And sometimes when we are trying to aim very accurately also with budget impact, we use, for instance, the time on treatment analysis that can be derived actually from the real world evidence. And this is actually all valuable, and I believe that the only downside that I can see is that at least in our country, the access to the RWE data is quite limited.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And now, when you don't have data in your own area, will payers look at data from other regions, and which ones in the region?
Yes, this is happening quite often. Players, if they don't have the data coming from Czech Republic locally, they don't have problem accepting the data from all over Europe, but sometimes also Europe may like the data. So in such a case, we don't have such a problem to accept the data on some kind of clinical situation also from the US and Canada. But we always think of some limitations stemming from the different clinical practice populations and so on. There were also some attempts to use data from Asia, like Japan, and there you must be very cautious because sometimes the mechanism of action in some of the targeted drugs is a little bit different in Asian versus Caucasian populations. So there is a huge caveat when you use the data from faraway geographies rather than the close ones.
Mm-hmm. And you're very politely avoiding US, so I'm going to ask Marco. Marco, what do they do in Italy with US data?
I mean, we use US data for sure, but I mean the topic it's a little bit complex because I mean when we talk about different geographics, we talk about also. And I agree what has been already said, also different potential clinical practice. So it means that probably not every data could be applied to your specific context. And for this reason, when you are going to use data coming from other country, I mean, one of the first steps to check is to understand if the clinical context could be overlap. Otherwise, you are comparing, you are trying to apply evidence that are comparable with your clinical practice. And for this reason, also, I think that something that is still missing to the topic of real-world evidence is something related to the methods. Probably we need, before you said you read the list of what ISPOR consider like real-world evidence, but probably we need more to more understand how should be the methods that can be shared in order to produce real-world evidence, and this support also other countries in use data that are produced outside. I make you. This is a very complex topic because it's connected not just with the clinical context, but is also connected with the way to gather real data, so different informative IT system or different way, specific study or what else. So you can have very different opportunity to get together real world data, and this means that it could be really difficult sometimes to receive real world data from other country and try to adapt to your context. So I have also in this case the example of what happening in Italy in COVID-19 patients that are and that pass their disease at home and they are not hospitalized. So there is a very big confusion, for example, of using corticosteroid in the first phase of the disease or not. So the majority of the clinicians doesn't support the use of corticosteroid in the first phase of the infection, but otherwise, I mean, in other part, in specific part of the country, this corticosteroids is used. And the reason for difficulties in gathering data, for difficulties in standardize specific real-world study to obtain some final conclusion in order to write some specific guidelines respect to use or not to use corticosteroids in early phase. Actually, after 1.5 years, I mean, there isn't at least a specific unique guidelines. Different guidelines are existing, coming from different clinical society, but the majority are against the use of corticosteroid in the first phase of the infection. But this I don't think that is the best way to use real-world evidence. What I expect after 1.5 years is to have a very, I mean, solid data respect to the use of the corticosteroid in early phase of COVID-19. And this means also that we have to move ahead in order to check in more precise way methods and way to get to collect this data and how and who is able to use in the right way this data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's something that you wonder about this use of data and if it's right to take decisions in that way. For example, if we go to the next point, we have real-world evidence to determine which product is better. There's quite some news these days about a study, a post-marketing surveillance study, where the drug in question had, well, not such a good adverse events profile as the competitors in the market. So, but when I read this, I start wondering, I said, well, are we sure that these patients have been selected the same way? Do you really give that one product to the same patients as to another product? What's the opinion of the people on this? So really looking at comparative effectiveness, simply looking at what happens in the market, you know, there are very well examples of false results from real-world data in the past. When you look at, I can take the textbook example, the COX inhibitors were a textbook example, that they were supposed to have less gastrointestinal problems. And in the observational studies, they had higher gastrointestinal problems. Why? Because the doctors selected, the treating physicians selected the patients with gastrointestinal risks already before giving these products. And so hence they had by default a more sensitive group of patients than the normal ones. So when I read this and I look at the question, which product is better in real world evidence, does this idea of bias and misinterpretation of data and channeling of how products are used lives with payers, or is this not aware? Are they not aware of this?
Well, this is Jim. I mean, I think there is a recognition that, you know, on the other question about RWE from other geographies, I mean, we have to take into account that, you know, everybody's healthcare system is a little different. So drugs get managed differently from place to place. You know, guides are probably developed differently depending on the nationalities and the view of specialists in certain areas. So yeah, I mean, we have to be real careful about how we apply real world evidence to comparative efficacy and the like. But I think a lot of that ends up getting sorted out over, again, product life cycles as we see what patterns of use emerge from physicians. As an example, autoimmune disorders. I mean, we've got all these different MOAs and they're growing every day, anti-TNFs, PDE4s, interleukin approaches, JAK inhibitors. You know, we see different patterns from disease to disease. I mean, you know, psoriasis, we're seeing a lot of use of IL-17s. You know, there's a lot of interest in RA and JAKs, although their safety profiles still have a lot of questions to sort out. So what we end up doing is we see, you know, how these drugs are being applied in the marketplace, which is sort of the definition of real world evidence. And we draw some conclusions from what we see there. And eventually guidelines get adapted. When you look at the list of factors at the bottom of your slide there, those are the kind of things that we can look at, you know, various nationalities and geographies. And, you know, if there's a safety problem that crops up in one area, it's, you know, likely going to be a problem in another. But because drugs are managed differently, depending on where you are, you know, it's possible that, you know, there's a confounding factor that, you know, there's a PA program in one country that doesn't apply to another country, and that's changing how the market share is growing for products. But you have to recognize those things could exist and adapt your analysis to that. But those are all pretty legitimate comparators that, you know, you could look at, just maybe not from country to country. You also, over here, you have to look at it from plan to plan. I mean, one insurer may favor one drug over another one. Maybe they favor Taltz over Cosentyx, and another guy favors Cosentyx over Taltz. You know, it's so you have to recognize that those things are out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jindřich, Marco, would you like to bring something to this topic?
Yes, I mean that real world evidence is a very big opportunity to check, I mean, the validity of the data coming from the clinical trial. And if a clinical trial is well done, is well designed, I mean, the expectation of the result that I have from real world evidence should be, I mean, assimilated to what is unfortunately, in the majority of the case, we have the design, still now, we have many clinical trials that have designed in a far way respect what is the real world evidence. Before comparative effectiveness has been mentioned, but in the reality, if you look also, if you look still now, many study design, I mean, the comparator that he uses not the standard of care. And this is the first point. The second point is that there is also a variability of the standard of care that can be related to the specific national context. So I think that real world evidence is a good thing to do for, I mean, all those products that have a big impact on the population in terms of benefit for the population, that have big impact in terms of better effectiveness, better disruptive effectiveness in managing different diseases. What is the problem from my point of view is that how have I to spend to produce this real world evidence? Because if I have to set a specific study of real world evidence for every drug or every devices that is a potential, can be a potential candidate for this kind of study, I'm going to need a lot of time, and I'm going to invest a very lot of money. So I think that the real explosion of real world evidence will be when we will be able to use, the IT system able to collect in a routine way a series of parameters that can be defined, and in this case we can have the possibility to manage a lot of quantity of real-world evidence study. I have the experience with the register of the National Agency for Drug in Italy. I don't know now, but up 2 years ago, they were managing more than 116 different registers. And this it's a very impegnative and very time and money consuming way. So I don't think that the explosion of real world evidence could be applied with specific single study. There has been the opportunity in specific situations, but generally speaking, I think that the real world evidence should be used for many products, but it needs to be used to gather the data in a routine way from a normal clinical activities. Obviously, looking for some basic method for designing the real world evidence.
Okay. So let's go probably to the next slide, because we're already touching on some weaknesses of real world evidence. Yeah. And we discussed confounding variables already shortly, but there were already ideas given also on where to look for and to be sensitive for confounding factors and sensitive of differences. They could be utilization in guidelines and ways that products are used. So can we come to some practical conclusions here? They'll say, well, this is what I would trust from real world evidence. This is what I would not trust from real world evidence. This is what I need to see when I see real world evidence. This is what I really make me distrust the data. Who would like to start on that one?
Well, this is Jim. I'll start. I think, again, there's a lot of skepticism about how real-world evidence is presented in many cases, and I think that this goes back to the competitive nature of the marketplace, how pharma takes data, mixes it up, and presents conclusions to health plans or PBMs that are allegedly drawn from the data, but if you looked at it a different way, maybe you'd see something else. And so we tend not to look at a lot of the data in depth that comes from pharma, because again, it's kind of the case that these guys are going to want to obviously favor their drugs as much as possible when they do these analyses. And we, if they come to us and say, hey, I developed this model and I assigned this value to this variable, somebody else may use a different value to the same variable. They may look at outside the hospital costs as this, and another company would look at it as that. It's, so the accuracy of the data is always going to be in question. I think, standardization of data, people get different data points and use those in their analyses. Often you don't have access to data, in a standalone PBM like the one I have worked with for a while. We got pharmacy data, but we don't have easy access to medical data, outcomes, lab values, etc. So these are all sort of hurdles you have to get over. And I think that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen as much growth in real world evidence outside of claims data. I mean, we can work with claims data. We know how to mix and match that ourselves. But when it comes to collecting the other elements that might make this more precise, more accurate, it may be hard to get. We may not have access to it. And we may look at it differently than somebody else looks at it. So most of our real world evidence to date is derived from what we see in our claims data, i.e. market share shifts, growth of one product versus another, development of a new standard of care. And we're going to have to get to the point where the standardization and the presentation of data is more consistent, whether that's an integrated national database or something along those lines. Everybody's got something different to work with.
Mm-hmm. Now, claims data for the European side, I would say, is used less. That's correct. Does anyone, Jindrich or Marco, have you been using the data from the reimbursement authorities on actual utilization or seeing use of these?
I mean, if the data are available, they are used. I mean, unfortunately, in the majority of the case, real data are not available at the time of the application for the authorization to market. I think that due to what is previously mentioned respect to the competitive environment that is on the market, I think that the topic of real-world data, real-world evidence should be needed by a strong public support. Strong public support, both from, in some way defining some basic rules, some basic methods for gathering this data, and this brings also the topic of the standardization of the data. At the European level, I think that, this role could be performed by the EMA that suggests, to other national agency, how to conduct, how to support the conduction of the real world evidence study. Then, for sure, we have a problem of the accuracy of the data. We have a problem of access to data. Now I'm thinking to all the, problem related to the GPRD, the privacy legislation that is least, but not just, at least very, very, very sensible in Europe, but I know that also in the United States and in Canada, they have similar legislation. So, probably also the some connection with this kind of legislation in order to facilitate the access to the data should be made, in particular for the future. I think that the future is on the real world evidence, because I expect to have many healthcare technology arriving into the market with a very poor packages of information.
So I can also share some experience with the real world data and their utilization by the authorities, because in our country, all the innovative treatments, they have their marketing authorization holders, they have the legislative obligation to set up a product registry and within 3 years to collect the data from the clinical practice. And the range of the data that is collected is actually defined by the drug agency SUKL, that is the regulatory body. And at the end of this 3-year period, it is evaluated, the data collected in the real world setup, and in the way that it is compared with the clinical trial, RCT clinical trial data. And then the result is whether it is comparable or not. If it's not comparable, then the product or the marketing authorization holder has a problem, because he needs to bring in more evidence to prove that actually the new intervention works, as it is not confirmed in the Czech clinical practice. And then we have also disease registries that are of much better use. for any purposes that are brought up by the authorities, because the thing is that they are having a longer history and the data are collected in the long term, longer than 3 years. That's why this is much preferred way of collecting the real world data, not through individually product registries, but through disease registries. I can also share with you one piece of information from 2010, when the regulators were looking for average clinical dose for anti-inflammatory group of drugs. It was the anti-TNF alpha, and they were collecting data from various registries from all over Europe, and also they reached out to the US. And finally, the effort was somehow to triangulate the most probable average daily dose, taking into consideration also the leading doses and so on. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that one of the limitations is, of course, the access to data. And if the access to the data was wider, then probably we can be utilizing the real world evidence data much more frequently, when we will be able to pull it together from various sources and to see where it matches. So this is the thing. So, and the limitation that everybody has to bear in mind for utilization of the real world data is, of course, the bias, especially the selection bias. And I know that we also submitted once to the authorities model outcome, where in sensitivity analysis we utilize the data from single arm real world case studies series. And it was accepted because it was a part of sensitivity analysis. And what also happened in this disease area, which is ophthalmology, the diabetic macular edema, was that the clinical practice deviated from the RCT in terms of dosing. The clinicians used different dosing that was captured in the real world data, whereas it was missing in the RCT. So that is a rare example of, let's say, utilization of this kind of data with the authorities.
Okay, let's go to the next slide, because I'm sensitive on time, knowing that we could probably discuss a full day about this subject. But saying, okay, what in your view, we have 3 questions here for the industry utilization of real world evidence. When should they be considering this? Where can it really help them? And if you would like to quote companies that would say shine in the way that they use real world evidence, could you give an answer to these 3 questions? I don't know who would like to start. Jim?
Yes.
Yeah.
Jim, I'll jump in. Again, real world evidence is going to accumulate over time. So it's unusual for us to see it early in the product life cycle. I would say that, part of the reason why we wait, 4 to 6 months after a new drug launches before we take a monograph to our Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee to make some decisions on where we're going to cover a drug is so that we can get that 4 to 6 months of data once it's launched. So, you can get some basic stuff, cost, weighted average cost of a product, market share, growth within a category. So we use that 4 to 6 months early data as part of our initial decision making. But then as time goes on, what we end up doing is we look at therapeutic categories on a regular basis. So, we'll make a decision on a new drug, then we'll look at that category again within another 6 to 12 months. And we'll bring all this RWE back into the discussion. What else have we learned since it's been out there? Have safety issues popped? Are we seeing different dosages being used? Are there off-label uses? And that will continue to grow over time. So, we have a responsibility to reflect, new information, new RWE as it comes in, and incorporate that into our decision making. When you talk about market access and pricing, if you're a new product entering an existing category, you can learn a lot from what the guys who came first have done. Where did they set the price for a category? competitively, where do you think you would best be positioned to try and gain market share since other folks have it already? So I think RWE becomes value. It's sort of a guessing game if you're the first one into a category. You're picking and choosing where you want to be, and a lot of times over here we'll see shadow pricing where companies will come out. When the I think when the DPP4s came out in diabetes, everybody priced their drug the same initially, and then became more of a discussion as time went on over to how do you change that, or do you contract to change that kind of a thing. So it's available, but usually not at the outset, and competitive strategies change over time. So if you want to make some changes to it, maybe not take a price increase one year, maybe more aggressively contract the next, those are all things you can do with RWE. I would hesitate to name a company who's using it really well, because we don't take a lot of RWE from pharma. We build it ourselves. We take it from the literature. We accumulate it from our data. I talked about claims data, studies that are done, particularly head-to-head studies. But it's pretty unusual for us to take a pharma-developed RWE model. We would never bring it to our P&T committee directly. We may look at it. We may incorporate some aspects of it. But right now it's still, from a pharma standpoint, I think they're still learning how to apply RWE creatively and accurately enough to get our interest.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Marco, you don't need to repeat what Jim said if you have the same opinion on something. So I would say, do you have another opinion? What can you add? What are your points on this? Marco?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I completely agree with Jim's statement, so I'm not repeating what he said.
Also on the last one?
Respect to the company you designed real world evidence, my perception is that actually companies are learning how to use real world evidence and how and when propose real world evidence to regulatory agency. So up to now, there's been a very, not generalized approach to real world evidence, but very micro specific initiative that has been proposed to the regulatory agency. So many of the big pharma or medical device company, in particular medical device company, need to learn to use in a more generalized approach real world evidence.
Yeah, okay. And Jindrich, please.
Yeah, I think that for the first two questions, I would probably bring up the question that arises all the time throughout the life cycle of each medicine, and this is the real cost in the real world. And if you are trying to get some illumination on this problem, then probably you need to look into the real cost at any period of the life cycle of the drug. And the companies that are doing the best in the area of RWE data, I think these are the companies that are producing targeted medicines and personalized medicines, because they are looking into the niche market where the data is missing and they need to produce it.
Yeah, okay, clear. Now, is it time for questions from the audience? We have 5 minutes left on the time, but I have not seen in the chat anything popping up. Is that correct, Steve?
Yeah, no chat. Yeah, if anyone does have a question, please enter it in the chat box and we'll address this to the panel.
Or wave your hand and we'll give you the voice. No, I don't see anything happening. Yeah, we see something. Yeah. Do you see any value of real-world evidence from major established products is the question. Who would like to take this question?
I would say, this is Jim, I would say that there is value to that. I think that, you know, rather than do a fully developed trial to try and add another indication late in the product life cycle, if you can get a study done or something along those lines that, you know, can be peer reviewed and published, it can differentiate your product potentially. I think that, you know, you have to consider again where you are in the life cycle and do you invest significant dollars in such a study, you know, if you're trying to bring other things to market or your patent is about to expire. So again, it's sort of a strategic decision as to, is there a niche or something that your competitors haven't gone after that warrants an investment in that area? But yeah, I mean, you know, we tend to think of if somebody's got the data and another company doesn't, it's going to be an easier sell to prescribers if you've got the data, and maybe that'll convince them to use the product more often.
Mm-hmm.
And if I may also jump in, I already described the topic of cost also is valid for the major products, but I think that over the time, the clinicians, they have sometimes a tendency to broaden the indications of the drug where the data is missing from RCT trials, and for major products, usually, not frequently, RCT trials are developed. So this is one example, and the other example is that the dosing can be also developing over time. So I think that there is always room to collect the evidence from real world for the major drug.
Yeah, and we got a second question from iPhone. Let's see. And the first one, how much evidence do you like to see for cellular therapies? I think we can all answer more than what you get normally. And so I'm focused on the second question. What about payers to collaborate with companies to gather the data about real world utility and the real world effectiveness of these products? So what do you think of that topic?
I mean, if I can comment this question, I have an example when it's been introduced 1 year and a half, the first CAR-T treatment in Italy for leukemia. So they introducing this new cellular therapy, and for defining characteristic of the center that were able to administrate this treatment, and also defining for the data that must be collected in order to produce result, in order to an eventually renegotiation of the pricing of the treatment. So I mean, I think that this is an example, but it means that there is, I mean, the capability and there is also the availability to accept, to collaborate with the company in a very transparent way in order to support the creation of new evidence when the evidence is not sufficient. It's not sufficient.
Okay, yeah,
Yes.
we are in the last minute already of this webinar, so time goes fast, obviously. And so can we Stephen? Yeah, thank you. So just one point from each of the panelists about one recommendation to the industry on one key learning point of today. Please, who would like to start? Jim, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, RWE is going to grow in importance, and I think the standardization of data would be probably of most help to us. That we're not constantly looking at different data points and the like. But I think the real learning point is that you're seeing regulatory environments adapt to the fact that this data can be applied outside of the initial approval of the drug, and plans will take that into account. Again, we're doing regular therapeutic category reviews, so keep it coming and make it as usable as possible.
Mm-hmm. Jindrich?
Yeah, I would like to pick up on what Jim actually said, that the regulator is, let's say, getting used to real-world evidence. And if we are going onto the European level, there is a couple of initiatives like Pharmaceutical Strategy for Europe that is going to be looking into common European platform for health data sharing. So I think that the companies were already invited for this as stakeholders, or they can also look into the big data steering group. And if they will achieve that this project will be moving on, we'll be able to share the data within Europe probably. And what will be the best if everybody can get an access to the primary anonymized data coming from these programs run by European Commission.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. And Marco? Last word.
My key point is that for those for manufacture in particular, for those products where real-world evidence is justified, please try to start to think to produce real-world evidence at the beginning when you define the study design of clinical trial, in order that the real-world evidence can represent a sort of continuation of the clinical trial in the clinical practice, in order to have data that can be standardized and that can be comparable.
Okay, thank you. So the time is round, so we go to the last slides, which is just to alert our attendees that we have a next meeting on the 4th of March on PROs in market access and pricing, followed by on the 15th of April in vitro diagnostics and medical devices market access. I think there's a very last slide behind that, which is just thank you for joining. And we will follow up with some spin-off of this meeting in due time, and we'll be defining exactly what we're doing there. Or maybe Stephen, you know that already.
Yeah, of course. There'll be a video from this RAF which will be published on our website, and there'll also be an output as well, and we'll let everybody know about that. Okay.
Jim, Marco, Jindrich, thank you very much for being with us. All the other people online listening to the discussion, I hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
My pleasure. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.